Victims of the Contaminated Blood Scandal have criticised the government for failing to cover their legal fees before a public inquiry. More than 3,000 people have died, many of them haemophiliacs, after being infected with HIV and hepatitis C. But this week their families found out that they would have to cover their own legal costs, a move described as cheap and insulting. Our health correspondent Paul Kelso reports.
Stuart McLean was just 8 when he was given a blood product he didn't need for a knee injury. 35 years later, he discovered it had infected him with hepatitis C.
My whole life career, 25-year career just down the tube. In the March, a couple of months later, I stood at a motorway bridge to jump off it. And if it wasn't for my grandson, then I probably would have jumped.
More than 7,500 people, most of them haemophiliacs, were infected with HIV and hepatitis C by contaminated blood products in the 70s and 80s. More than 3,000 died. A public inquiry will begin later this year, but this week victims were told that, unlike the Grenfell Tower inquiry, their legal advice to help them prepare would not be paid for. In a letter seen by Sky News, the Cabinet Office said it was funding the victims of Grenfell, in which 71 people were killed, because of the exceptional and extraordinary circumstances that survivors and victims' families found themselves in. The blood victims point out that 70 people have died since their inquiry was announced, and said it is totally unacceptable and has only fuelled the long-held feeling of this community that the victims and families of this scandal should be dealt with as cheaply and as insultingly as possible.
It's absolutely disgusting the way they feel like we're a cheaper version of Grenfell. That's the way I feel. That how can you give one funding and not the other? It's the same thing. It's a public inquiry. It just doesn't make sense.
Victims and relatives of those affected by the Contaminated Blood Scandal will meet with the inquiry chairman, Justice Brian Langstaff, here at the Cabinet Office, and the final decision on whether their legal representation will be paid for rests with him. And he faces a challenge to win the trust of people who have waited decades for the truth.
It's like they're putting stumbling blocks in our way if the inquiry's even got going. Doesn't give me much faith.
Paul Kelso, Sky News.